Hello, everyone. This is another discussion video in the discussion series we're releasing bi-weekly. This one is tunneling in on crash-based fuzzing. We've talked about it a lot on the podcast. We've seen, fuzzing kind of increase in popularity over the years, and we wanted to do a discussion on the value of fuzzing and, when it can be worth it. Because I think we both agree it's context specific, and it's kind of important to understand the benefits and the downsides, and where it's most worth the time and effort to apply it, right? So your kind of stance lately has been fuzzing is unreasonably effective. And I don't know if you want to kind of elaborate on that a little bit here in this video here.
Yeah, and that's a phrase. I don't remember where I picked it up, but I picked that up and I kind of like it just because it hits on the point where fuzzing is one of those things you set it, or in theory, you should just be able to kind of set it to run, leave it, come back later, and you've got vulnerabilities. It's not always that case. It's not always that simple. But I mean, I do kind of like that phrase of, the unreasonable efficiency of fuzzing. That said, I do think it's important to kind of cover what exactly we're talking about, because fuzzing can mean quite a few different things. It is, kind of a fuzzy term. So specifically what we're going to be talking about, Spectre already mentioned, the crash-based fuzzing. So that is fuzzing that's looking for crashes. So this is usually going to be in programs that manage their own memory for the most part, memory corruption types of issues. Things that cause crashes. And the reason for that comes down to the fact that if you have an exploitable bug, so a bug that can take control of like the PC register, it's going to be able to crash the program. Now, it's not always the case that every crash is exploitable. That's not the case. But almost every exploitable vulnerability will be able to cause a crash. So that's why crashing is important. And it's just opposed to other types of testing and, say, more dynamic languages where you might only get, exceptions can still cause crashes too, but you might only get exception. You might only get like an error message coming out. There's fuzzing for that, which I don't think we're going to be talking about too much for this discussion. And the other thing is kind of, where's the line between fuzzing and just automated testing? With fuzzing, we're talking kind of that randomized input, some program generating random input. It's not a human behind all of the inputs. And mutating that input, doing random changes on it, but it's also different from, say, automated testing, where you might have a set of test cases that you've automated to run. So you could imagine that more on web hacking, where somebody might have a script that'll automatically test certain bad characters and see how the output is impacted, or see if they're sanitized, things like that. There is a difference between the two, one being completely random, or random in some guided programmatic way, versus more trying to match test cases. Hopefully that kind of clarifies what we're talking about. If not, leave a comment. And then when it comes down to worthwhile, I'm a big fan of telling people to use fuzzing during the software development lifecycle. As you're developing, fuzz, get all the crashes, get bugs out of the system there. But what we're talking about here is going to be fuzzing specifically for finding vulnerabilities, for finding those exploitable issues in software. And we're comparing this, worthwhile compared with the manual assessment, compared with actually doing that work up front, following through the code, finding your issues that way.
So kind of touching on that point with you saying that you like it in the development process. I think that's kind of like why you liked that one fuzz framework that Microsoft dropped. Even though some other people that I know weren't, they thought it was kind of just a PR thing and didn't think it was that impressive.
It's not that impressive, but they are making it easier for developers to incorporate. Sorry, go ahead.
I didn't want to touch on that too much. I just wanted to kind of bring that up since it is kind of recent. But so my stance on fuzzing for vulnerabilities has really shifted over the last year or so. Previously, in past years, my perspective was always, it's not going to hit deep bugs. What your fuzzer finds, other fuzzers are probably going to find as well. There's a lot of collision. But I think that was just because I was a little bit ignorant when it came to the fuzzing field. After I personally researched into it a bit more and looked into it and played around with it myself, I got a lot more interested. Now, what I originally thought is still kind of true, until you looked at more of the like custom work that goes into it. So if you just use like some open source fuzzer and run it with no changes, then what I said probably still applies. You're probably still going to get a lot of collision. Um, but obviously that custom work that goes into it can yield some interesting results. But that custom work also involves a lot of time and research into doing, which may or may not be worth it, which is what we're going to try to get into this video.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on one of the important things is, you go back 10 years ago, we're talking about things like Sully as your fuzzer. Some really, or not Sully, sorry, Sully's newer. Spike. That's what I'm thinking of. But some really basic fuzzers that really do what I said before, just randomized input. I mean, some of the early like kernel syscallers, or sorry, syscall fuzzer. I obviously syscaller being a popular Linux kernel fuzzer, I have that in my mind. But just going back to the early fuzzers, the Linux kernel was like just literal, completely random syscalls being made. No real intelligence behind how it did its randomized input. Um, I mean, I guess bit flipping is still a technique you use. You take a no and good input, flip a random bit in it, see what happens, and keep doing that and keep track of what's going on. But things have gotten a lot more intelligent in terms of like the accessible fuzzing, the fuzzing that like the types of fuzzer anybody can go download and start working with. Now you've got all the code coverage, AFL obviously being the big one. You've got code coverage, you've got symbolic execution being added into some of them, concolic and hybrid fuzzers. You've got a ton of different techniques that, like, there's a lot of constant research going on with the fuzzing. And a lot of it now is meant to be used in a kind of augmented way, where it augments the human researcher. You still need to do a lot of the manual work, but you use that, and it benefits you in understanding the code base, and you're able to use that to improve the fuzzer to get more directed, find those deeper issues that just completely randomized fuzzers just aren't really going to hit.
So I think before we get into where it's worth it and where it isn't, it's worth talking about some of the benefits and downsides of fuzzing. So some of the nice things that come with fuzzing is, I think we've kind of talked about it before, but you get that it's an issue, um, kinds of findings. Whereas if you're doing something like manual code review, you have to kind of guess and assume that it's an issue and then kind of test that. So your assumption may not always be accurate, and there is that manual labor involved in confirming that it's even a bug and even worth investigating. Whereas with the fuzzing, if it's a crash, there's a problem there. It's not crashing for no reason. um, the other thing is, kind of like what you touched on earlier, you can leave it running passively while you're doing other things like manual review or augmenting manual review. So you can do manual review looking for bugs and improving the fuzzing. Or it can just be running while you're not doing anything, like sleeping or doing other life activities and stuff. And the other thing with fuzzing that I think some people kind of overlook sometimes is it's good at showing what's reachable and what isn't. When you're doing manual review, it's very easy to go into rabbit holes in code that might not even be reachable. You could just be looking at dead code in terms of like from a vulnerability standpoint. So it's, fuzzing, you always have a path. When you get a crash, you might not always get like a perfect reproducer, but you'll have like a stack trace. You'll know how that path is getting reached. Whereas with manual, with the levels of abstraction, it's easy to get lost there. That being said, I mean, there's some downsides of fuzzing too. Like I said earlier, you're probably going to be hitting some of those more shallow bugs. There can be a lot of work in triaging. Fuzzing is probably going to find a lot of issues that aren't interesting from an exploitation perspective. Like if you're fuzzing kernel or something like that and you find null pointer dereferences, or even anything userland, anything at all, null pointer dereferences are basically useless from an exploitation perspective. So there's a lot more noise involved when you're doing fuzzing as well that you have to sift through. And depending on the instrumentation available, you could miss a lot of bugs. So an example that I always kind of like to jump back on there is out of bounds writes and reads on the stack. But if it's only like by a few bytes, so let's say you're writing out of bounds by 4 bytes on an array, that's probably not going to get caught by your instrumentation. if it doesn't cause a crash, right? So we're talking about crash-based fuzzing, but there are cases where there's exploitable bugs that aren't going to produce a crash, and those could be missed where they would be caught in manual review.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And there have been, or there is some work going into causing crashes on those cases. So I think the most obvious case is going to be ASAN,
Yeah.
Address Sanitizer, which tries to detect some of those cases. I think mostly around the heap. I think it has some instrumentation around the stack, but I couldn't recall what that is directly. But the idea there still being it tries to detect some of those overflows and then it causes a crash. Which, just as an aside, I've also heard of people solving like RE CTF challenges by injecting a crash when it would print the flag and then just letting a like AFL run on the program until it eventually figured out the flag. But I mean, you hit the right point there with also triaging. Kind of the workload is a little bit different when it comes to fuzzing versus the manual review. With the manual review, you spend a lot of time upfront understanding your code base. You're usually targeting like specific module, a specific area of code. You spend a lot of time looking over that code, really understanding it. Like the start of any project is going to be understanding your target. When it comes to fuzzing, you're kind of able to learn a bit of that as you go. You set up your fuzzer, maybe you don't have it going very deep, you don't have a good corpus or anything for it to work from. But it fuzzes for a while, you get a crash, and then you start being able to dig in, you see kind of the calling path, and you learn, you kind of have to do all of that work about understanding the code paths, understanding the architecture. You have to do all of that once you've discovered your first crash and you start triaging it. It kind of offloads it to the end to when you have a crash to work through versus the manual stuff where you kind of do it up front.
So for those curious, I will just touch on the address sanitizer point. Basically, how that works is address sanitizer places red zones in the heap and stack, and then just looks for reads and writes into those red zones. So that could be something that could be fun to look into if you're curious about that. When you get into where it's worth it, I think the most obvious place is probably where it's easy to deploy dumb fuzzing and you're likely to get results. So where I think places like that are probably like file format fuzzing, fuzzing parsers, and stuff like that. Getting into more complex targets, I'd say browsers, mostly because manual code review in browsers is so difficult because there's so many layers of abstraction with C++ and inheritance and stuff like that. So browsers, I think, are a really good place for fuzzing, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the cutting edge stuff happening there. And then on top of that, operating systems, especially open source ones with instrumentation support that the fuzzing can kind of utilize.
Yeah, I would kind of generalize that out to just complex projects are generally going to be worth fuzzing. Like those large complex projects that are going to take you a long time to get that really deep understanding. Fuzzing is your shortcut to still getting some bugs. And the other thing is once you start finding crashes, that gives you a place to start looking at. That's kind of your code smell. I guess developers might use that a little differently, but that's kind of your warning sign that maybe there are some further issues here that are going to warrant the manual auditing. It gives you a place to start looking when at first, if you're just targeting something, you don't really know what areas are going to be susceptible to issues. Having a really complex target, tossing a fuzzer at it, even a dumb fuzzer, is still going to get you some results to start looking at, or is likely to. I guess I can't guarantee results with a fuzzer. But as I've said already, it has been unreasonably effective.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics from fuzzing alone are kind of really interesting to look at. Like seeing the amount of code coverage you can get, the amount of crashes in a specific area. That's all gonna hint at like the code quality and whether that area is worth looking at or not. Like, yeah, even ignoring the findings specifically of fuzzing, the stats alone offers some unique and interesting insights that you won't get with just manual review. Um, Getting into where it's probably not worth it, you were saying it's worth it like with complex projects, and that's where I'd say I feel like IoT is somewhere where I'd say it's probably not really worth it. I don't know if it'd be worth the effort of like setting up a harness to be able to hit it, right? You can probably find issues pretty quickly and easier with just doing manual review. I just don't really see if there's a benefit in investing the time mostly into doing it in IoT.
Yeah, so part of the thing also is, I mean, IoT is kind of notorious for having a ton of bugs. And when you have a piece of software that does have a lot of bugs, and this is going to be true with complex too, like you can kind of get trapped with having too many bugs that a fuzzer just can't get very deep because it keeps getting stuck on like a really early bug.
That's a very good point. Yeah.
So with IoT, uh, yeah, I haven't done like a lot of really focused IoT work. So I don't want to step in and say that, like, I feel like a professional might actually jump in and, correct us and be like, oh no, we use fuzzing all the time for that. I From the outside though, like I do agree with you that it seems like, the cost of setting up a harness, if it's easy to set up a fuzzing harness, then it might not be so bad. Like if it's over the network, you can usually fuzz that pretty easily. So the inputs do matter on that. But when it is something kind of, I'd say, a softer target, hasn't really been hardened, fuzzing might just end up giving you way too many results to be useful. Kind of like a lot of false positives, a lot of things you just don't care about. But I guess the only way you're going to know if you're going to get that is just by setting up the fuzzer and seeing that, okay, you're actually getting like 1,000 crashes a minute. In which case that fuzzer probably isn't too useful.
Yeah. The other area I'd say fuzzing might not really be worth the amount of investment into it is games. Like let's say hitting like Source Engine, for example, because there's probably going to be a lot of manual overhead when it comes to setting up a harness because games are just so complex, especially in like with their inputs, right? You have to often authenticate, you have to learn the packet structure, connect to a match, probably. Like there's a lot of work that goes into even getting to the point where you get to the interesting code when live testing with games.
Though
And also,
you could kind of argue though that that cost is going to be there when you're doing something that, unless you're purely doing static assessment, you're still going to have to do some of that work anyhow to get yourself testing on a game and even on IoT. Like some of that work does need to happen regardless. And once that happens, I mean, would you say that if the harness was easy or if somebody else did that work, that fuzzing would be useful in those areas?
well, okay, that's a fair point, but the other problem with games is most of the time with games, it's not open source. You don't have source access, which means you don't have any ability to compile in instrumentation. So it's also that's going to hurt how effective the fuzzing is tremendously, not having access to instrumentation, unless you're doing like binary patching level instrumentation, which there is some research into, but I don't really think it's there yet. And I think that could also be applied to IoT too, because I imagine it's not super often you're hitting IoT devices where you have the source either. So that's a big consideration for both IoT and games is the lack of source.
Yeah, black box is definitely takes a little bit more effort. But if you're dealing with something like a file format or network, you've got a packet protocol that you can kind of follow and fuzz on that level, which
Yeah,
does
for
give you
sure.
something. You don't get the instrumentation as you're saying. There are
That's the
ways
big one
around
for
that.
me.
Hypervisor, for running it under a hypervisor, for example, you can kind of get some of that coverage information out of that. There are ways around that. As I said, it's an active area of research, something that, as far as I'm aware, isn't quite there yet. Although I've been seeing recommended a talk. I want to say it's fairly recent about high speed black box testing. I'm just going
Uh,
to look that up.
that was the CCC talk. I think you're talking about, right? That was
Yeah, I
N
think it would be
space.
CCC.
Yeah,
Um, okay, yeah, I've seen that one kind of recommended. So
that
perhaps
was a good
something out of
talk.
that. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I watched that talk live. It was a very good talk. Overall, though, I think I'd kind of put the final point in that there are still people of the opinion that fuzzing is focused on too heavily. Like people put too much stock in fuzzing, and that manual review is still worth the trade off of some of the the higher overhead of manual effort, just because of the fact that bugs found by manual review could survive longer and are potentially more interesting from an exploitation point of view. Personally, where I come down on fuzzing is um, it's often worth it to deploy it along with manual review. It's just a hybrid setup, I think, is the best way to go in most scenarios. Um, I think you probably are along the same lines as me
Yeah,
with that, right?
absolutely. I definitely hold that. Don't get rid of manual review. Fuzzing is not a replacement. Automated testing is not a replacement for those human findings. But fuzzing is something that, I mean, as I've said before, developers can implement that into their flow. They don't need to be experts in security to still find issues with that and not need to pay an expert to come in and look at their code. But in terms of us trying to find the vulnerabilities, it's these days I'd say it's pretty much a necessary part of the workflow. Is you're still doing the manual work, but you're also running a fuzzer on the side. It's there to augment, not replace.
Yeah, I think that's a good ending point. So that being said, that's gonna sum up all the points we have in this video. Keep an eye out in 2 weeks on 2 weeks Thursday. That's when our next discussion video is going to be out. We also have the podcast on Mondays at 3 p.m. Eastern, 12 p.m. Pacific, where we have these kinds of discussions, but more on relevant recent news topics and stuff like that. So you can check that out if you're interested. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Keep an eye out for our next discussion video, and we will see you guys then.